There's a version of tired that sleep does not fix. Not the tiredness of a long week or a late night or a season of hard work that the body needs time to recover from. Something deeper than that. A tiredness that lives below the physical, in the part of a person that processes meaning and manages emotion, and carries the accumulated weight of everything that has been asked of them for longer than they have been able to sustain it. A tiredness that 8 hours of sleep leaves completely untouched because sleep was never the thing it needed. Most people who are living inside this kind of exhaustion do not know what it is. They know what it feels like. The inability to start tasks that should be simple. The hours that disappear into nothing productive despite genuine intention. The gap between who they know themselves to be and who they are managing to be on any given day. A gap that grows and grows until the only explanation that feels available is the one that lands hardest and does the most damage. I am lazy. It is a verdict delivered without evidence and accepted without examination. A conclusion that feels true because the behavior it describes is real, the tasks not started, the goals not pursued, the days that end without the progress that was planned, even though the cause it assigns is completely wrong. You are not lazy. You are running on empty. And there is a profound difference between those two things, a difference that changes everything about what the situation actually requires. Jake had been calling himself lazy for 14 months before he found out what was actually wrong. Stay with us, because today we are telling the story of a man who spent over a year punishing himself for a character flaw he did not have, and what he stumbled across that finally gave him the right name for what he was carrying. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because somebody out there needs to hear exactly this today. Jake was 32 years old and had a list of things he was ashamed of that he reviewed, with brutal consistency, every single evening before bed. Not out loud, not written down, just present in the particular quality of the quiet that arrived when the day was done, and there was nothing left to distract him from the accounting. The tasks he had planned to do and had not done, the project he had been meaning to advance and had not touched, the workout he had intended to complete and had talked himself out of before 11 in the morning, the calls he had been putting off, the decisions he had been avoiding, the version of himself that he had been meaning to become and kept failing to show up as. He had a word for this pattern. He had been using it for 14 months. Lazy. It was a word he applied to himself with a precision and a consistency that left no room for alternative explanations. The evidence was right there, reviewed nightly, the undone things, the avoided things, the gap between intention and execution that had been widening steadily for over a year. What else could it be? He was not unintelligent. He was not lacking in ambition. The ambition was present, painfully present, which was what made the failure to act on it so difficult to justify in any other terms. He had the desire. He had the knowledge. He had the time, technically. What he did not have, what he had not had for 14 months and had not identified as missing, was the emotional capacity to convert any of it into sustained action. The 14 months had not been ordinary months. They had begun with the end of a 5-year relationship. Not a dramatic ending, but a slow, grinding dissolution that had required more emotional processing than Jake had allowed himself to give it because processing it properly would have required stopping, and stopping felt like failure of a different kind. He had pushed through it, kept working, kept showing up, kept performing the functional version of himself for everyone who needed the functional version, while the part of him that needed attention went unattended. 3 months after the relationship ended, his mother had been diagnosed with a condition that was serious enough to require ongoing treatment and frightening enough to occupy a permanent corner of his awareness regardless of what else he was doing. He had managed this the same way he managed everything, by continuing to function, by being the person his family needed, by adding the emotional weight of it to the load he was already carrying without ever setting any of the previous weight down. 6 months after that, a restructuring at his company had eliminated his role and required him to negotiate his position within a reorganized team. a process that had been resolved in his favor, but had consumed 3 months of sustained professional anxiety that had left marks he had not examined. Jake had been through 14 months of sustained emotional demand, loss, fear, uncertainty, grief, without ever treating any of it as something that required genuine recovery. He had treated it as whether to be endured and moved through, and he had moved through it. And on the other side of it, he had found himself unable to do the things he used to do easily, and had concluded that the inability was a character deficiency, rather than the entirely predictable consequence of a person who had been running on empty for over a year without stopping to refuel. He was not lazy. He was depleted in a way that had a name and a cause and a remedy, none of which he had access to because he had been using the wrong word. The shift arrived on a Tuesday evening through the most ordinary of routes. Jake had been doing what he often did in the hours when he could not bring himself to do the things he had planned, moving through his phone with the unfocused drift of someone killing time they feel guilty about spending this way. A video appeared in his feed. Not a motivational video. He had developed an allergy to those, having consumed many of them in the previous 14 months in the hope that sufficient inspiration would compensate for whatever was missing. This was different. A researcher speaking quietly and directly about the concept of emotional exhaustion, not burnout in the loosely used, often glamorized sense of the word, but the specific, documented, neurologically grounded state of a person whose emotional processing resources have been chronically overtaxed without recovery. The researcher described the symptoms with a clinical precision that Jake recognized as a description of himself: the inability to initiate tasks, the paralysis in the face of things that should be simple, the gap between knowing what needs to be done and being able to do it, the exhaustion that sleep did not resolve, the shame spiral that formed when the inability was interpreted as laziness rather than depletion, and the way the shame itself became an additional emotional tax on a system that was already overdrawn. Jake watched the video twice. Then he sat in the particular silence of someone who has just had something explained to them that they have been living inside without understanding for a very long time. He was not lazy. He had never been lazy. He had been a person carrying 14 months of unprocessed emotional weight while simultaneously shaming himself for the symptoms that weight produced, which had added shame to the load without reducing any of it, making the depletion deeper and the recovery harder with every passing week. The remedy the researcher described was not a productivity system or a motivation strategy. It was recovery. Genuine, deliberate, unapologetic emotional recovery. The kind that required acknowledging what had actually happened in the previous 14 months rather than continuing to move past it as though movement were the same as processing. Jake did not fix everything that evening. Recovery from genuine emotional exhaustion does not happen in an evening. But he did one thing that mattered more than he understood at the time. He stopped calling himself lazy. He retired the verdict, not because the behavior had changed, but because he finally understood that the behavior was a symptom and he had been treating it as a cause. He started for the first time in over a year to give himself what the situation had always required: not harder pushing but genuine rest, not more discipline but actual recovery, not shame applied to the gap between who he was and who he intended to be, but honest acknowledgement of what he had been through and what it had cost. The tasks did not all start moving immediately, but they started moving. Slowly at first, the way a tank that has been running on fumes takes time to respond when fuel is finally added, then more consistently. Then, with something approaching the ease that Jake had been trying to manufacture through willpower alone for 14 months and had never been able to sustain because willpower cannot compensate for an empty tank. He had not needed more discipline. He had needed someone to tell him what was actually wrong. Laziness is real, but it is far rarer than we apply the word. The person who cannot start the task, cannot sustain the effort, cannot bridge the gap between their intention and their action, that person is almost never lazy in the way the word implies. They are almost always carrying something that has not been addressed, processing something that has not been processed, running on a reserve that was depleted long ago and has not been replenished because nobody told them that replenishment was what the situation required. The shame that follows the nightly accounting, the verdict delivered without evidence, the identity built around a failure that is actually a symptom, does not produce recovery. It produces more depletion. It adds weight to a person who is already overloaded and calls it motivation. It is not motivation. It is damage. If you have been calling yourself lazy for longer than feels fair, if the gap between who you know yourself to be and who you are managing to be has been widening despite genuine effort and genuine desire, stop and ask a different question. Not what is wrong with me, but what have I been carrying for how long without stopping to set it down? You are not lazy. You are possibly the most effortful person you know, effortful in ways that are invisible because they are emotional rather than productive, consuming rather than creating, pointed inward rather than outward. Jake spent 14 months punishing himself for running on empty. The day he stopped punishing and started recovering was the day the tank finally began to fill. Stop blaming yourself. Start asking what you actually need. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.